The hall fell silent the moment he stepped in front of her. Caelum Ashvorne, the Alpha King who had never once broken rank for anyone, stood between Elara and the ancient vampire lord demanding her return, his jaw set, his eyes burning amber in the firelight. Behind him, Lady Seren had just pointed at the servant girl and spoken her betrayal aloud to the entire court. Dravin Mocheles didn't flinch. He simply watched, red-eyed and patient, the way predators watch things that have already been decided. One word from Caelum could end it. Hand her over. Save the castle. Save his pack. Instead, he said, "She is mine." A servant girl. A secret library. A bite that broke a seal buried in her blood since childhood, and a vampire who had been waiting 200 years to collect her. So why would the most powerful alpha in Europe risk everything for a girl no one was supposed to notice? The candle was too small for the room. "Papers," he said. Elara did not mind. "Toll, then." She had been here since the castle quieted, since the last torch in the eastern corridor was extinguished, since Lady Seren's attendants had finished their late whispered conversations and retreated behind closed doors. Elara had counted the silences the way she counted everything, carefully, without being seen. The north window's broken latch was her secret. She had discovered it at 13, told no one, returned to it every night for 7 years. The library was forbidden to servants. She went anyway. She turned a page. And then, a sound. Not the wind, not the settling of old stone. Footsteps, deliberata, coming from the main corridor. The candle was out before she had decided to extinguish it. Her body moved faster than her mind, trained by 12 years of occupying rooms she had no right to. She was on her feet, the book pressed to her chest, sliding into the gap between two shelving units before the door opened. The darkness became absolute. She pressed her back to cold wood and held her breath. A flame appeared. A full candle, properly lit, carried by a hand she could not yet see. The light moved into the room. Stopped. She heard. She was almost certain she heard, breathing slow into something deliberate, something not quite human in its precision, the way an animal pauses when it has already identified what it is looking at. Then a voice, quiet in the way that very certain things are quiet. Legere potes. Latin. Perfect, unaccented, casual as conversation. Elara froze. The candle moved toward her shelf. She understood, somewhere behind her sternum, that hiding was already over, that it had been over the moment he'd spoken. She stepped out from behind the shelf before he reached her. Caelum Ashvorne stood 3 feet away. She had seen him before, of course. 12 years at Ashenveil meant she had watched him grow from a boy with sharp shoulders and sharper eyes into this, whatever this was. He was tall in the way that made rooms seem smaller, dressed in the plain dark wool he wore when he returned from night patrols, his hair still carrying the cold, a few traces of melted snow on his collar. He held the candle at chest height and looked at the book she clutched against herself. Then he looked at her. His eyes were the color of charcoal at the center, smoke at the edges, and they held the particular quality of a person accustomed to seeing in poor light. She had the peculiar, embarrassing sensation of being read, not judged. Read. The way he read pages. She said nothing. Her tongue had apparently left the premises. He looked at the book again. Herbal medicine. A Latin compendium. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite surprise. Something without a name she knew. "Can you read it?" he said again, still in Latin. "Or did you take it for the illustrations?" Her chin went up before she could stop it. Distingo inter Valerianum officinalem et Valerianum dioicem punt ut. I can distinguish between common Valerian and marsh Valerian dont. The illustrations are adequate, but anatomically imprecise on the root bifurcation. Silence. Not an uncomfortable silence. A different kind. The silence of someone recalibrating. Your name, he said finally, in his own language now, as if the Latin had been a test and she had passed it. Elara, my lord. Elara. He said it the way people say a word in a foreign language they have read but never heard spoken aloud. Then, you can keep the candle. I have another. He turned, took a different candle from the shelf beside the door. She had not noticed it there, placed as if expected, lit it from his own, and walked to the far reading table. He sat. He opened a book he had apparently already selected. He did not look at her again. She stood in the middle of the library for a moment that felt architectural, load-bearing somehow, in the structure of something she could not name yet. And then she sat back down in her chair, in her small circle of light, and opened her Latin compendium. Neither of them spoke again that night. When she returned to her room before dawn, she moved through the cold corridor, with her heart still doing something irregular. She did not understand it. She put it away. She found it on her window ledge the following morning, between the water ewer and the shutter latch. A key, iron, old, fitted to the library lock. No note. No name. She picked it up and turned it over in her fingers. The metal was cold from the night. She stood there for a long time in the gray winter light, while outside the snow continued its patient accumulation against the castle walls. The north window's broken latch had been repaired. She had noticed this when she'd left before dawn. The wood replaced, the mechanism new, the former gap sealed as if it had never existed. She could no longer enter without a key. She had been given a key. She put it in the small cloth pouch she kept inside her bodice, where she kept the things she did not want anyone to find, and she pressed her hand flat against her sternum for a moment afterward, as if to hold the warmth there before it could escape. The books appeared one at a time. She would arrive to find one placed at the end of the table nearest her usual chair, set spine up, as if someone had put it down mid-thought. An Arabic treatise on celestial navigation, a Greek dialogue on the nature of the soul, a small, battered volume on Bohemian mineralogy that smelled of somewhere far away. She would sit, open the new book, read a page, and eventually reach for her own. On the third occasion, she arrived to find him already there. He was at the far end of the table, his back to the window, reading with the focused economy of someone who had long practice making himself unreachable in public. He did not look up when she entered. She did not speak. She took her usual chair. She opened the book he had left, the Greek dialogue, and read. The candle between them burned down 2 inches before either of them moved. She was not, strictly speaking, looking at him. She was reading. But the candlelight reached that far, and she was aware. In the way one is aware of a fire without looking directly into it, of the angle of his jaw, the slope of his shoulder, the way his hand turned a page with the same unhurried deliberateness with which he seemed to do everything. He was not performing stillness. He simply was still, the way old stone is still, the way deep water is still, not emptiness, but density. She turned back to her own page and read the same sentence 4 times. That night, he walked out before her without a word. She sat for a moment in the quiet he had left behind, which was a different quality of quiet than the room's ordinary silence. Warmer, somehow, the air rearranged by the fact of him having occupied it. She noted this with the same care she gave to the difference between Valerian species, and decided she had no useful framework for it. She went to bed and slept better than she had in weeks. "He sent her a letter," Mira said. She was refolding a pile of linen at the foot of Elara's bed, her voice carrying the particular tone she used for information that was both delightful and unsettling to her. "Lady Seren, this morning after after the hall." Elara was at the window, braiding her hair, her fingers still. "The hall. That morning." Lady Seren's voice, cutting through the breakfast noise. "You clumsy, worthless girl," over a broken cup that had slipped from Elara's hands when a hound had startled her. The entire room had heard. Elara had gathered the shards without raising her eyes. "What was in the letter?" she asked. "No one knows. But she hasn't raised her voice at anyone since, not even her own women." Elara looked at the reflection of her own hands in the dark window glass. She thought about the way he had walked past the hall that morning. She had seen him from the corner of her eye, without stopping, without even turning his head. He had seemed entirely uninvolved. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Mira folded a sheet with unnecessary precision. "No reason. No reason." Something warm moved through Elara's chest, low and quiet, like an ember caught by a draught. She smothered it methodically and finished braiding her hair. She felt him before she saw him. No, that was not quite accurate. What she felt was a change in the quality of the air at the end of the corridor, a subtle density, as if the space itself had become more occupied. She was carrying a basket of dried lavender bundles from the storeroom, walking with her head down, counting the flagstones the way she always did in long corridors. She looked up. He was at the far end of the passage, freshly returned from the night patrol. She could tell by the way the cold still lived in his coat, by the melted snow at his collar, by the particular surface tension in his posture, that she had come to recognize as the contained presence of the wolf that lived just beneath the man. The moon had been full these past 3 nights. She did not know precisely what that meant for werewolves, only what she had read in the manuscripts, and the manuscripts had been inconsistent. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. The corridor was long. The distance between them was perhaps 30 feet. It should have been enough. It felt like nothing, like a measurement that no longer applied. He walked toward her. She did not move, not because she was paralyzed. She examined herself quickly and found that wasn't it, but because something had decided, in the space below conscious thought, that there was nowhere in particular she needed to be. He stopped in front of her, closer than the corridor required. His eyes were dark in the torch shadows, that smoke and charcoal gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at a page he was trying to commit to memory. "You're working late," he said. His voice was lower than usual, or the stone corridor made it seem that way. "The lavender needs to be sorted before it dries unevenly." He looked at the basket, then back at her face. "Come, roll." Not a question, not quite a command. Something in between that she had no framework for resisting. The storeroom was small and smelled entirely of green things. Dried thyme hung in bundles from the low beams, rosemary in terracotta pots along the sill, the sweet dark scent of dried violets in a basket near the door. A single candle burned on the workbench. Elara set her basket down and turned. He was standing just inside the doorway, not having entered fully, as if maintaining some option she could not name. The silence had weight. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked. She considered this honestly. The thing happening in her chest was not fear. She felt fear before, and it lived in her throat and her heels, always pointing toward exit. This lived somewhere else entirely, lower and warmer and without direction. "My lord should know," she said carefully, "that my heart is beating very quickly at the moment." "I know." The words landed quietly. "I know." Because he could hear it. Because the wolf in him could hear the percussion of her own body giving her away, and he was telling her this without pretense, without gentleness, a simple fact. Her hands gripped the edge of the workbench. He moved toward her, not quickly, the way a predator closes distance, but slowly, with the deliberateness of someone choosing each step. She did not retreat. The workbench was at her back. She could have moved sideways. She did not. He stopped in front of her. His breath was visible in the cold room, thin white tendrils in the candlelight. She was tall for a woman, and still he was something else entirely above her. She looked up at the angle of his jaw, the dark line of his throat, the stillness of his expression that was not coldness, but the face of a person who had learned to keep the interior separate from the exterior, and was, in this moment, failing slightly at. His hand came up, slowly, his fingers wrapped, barely, the suggestion of a grip, around her wrist, over the place where her pulse was loudest. The warmth was immediate. His skin was always warmer than hers. She had registered this before without truly registering it, without allowing herself to register it. Now there was nowhere else to put the information. "I will ask you once," he said. "If you say no, I walk out of this room and we don't speak of it." She looked at him for a long time. The candle threw shadows upward across his face, catching the edge of his cheekbone, the darkness of his eyes. She thought about 12 years of making herself invisible. 12 years of becoming fluent in languages no one expected her to speak, of reading books in the dark, of being present in rooms without ever being seen in them. "I have lived here for 12 years, she said quietly, "and you are the first person who has ever looked at me as if I was worth the looking." That was not yes. It was not no. His mouth found the curve of her neck, just below her jaw, and then the sharp, bright flare of his bite, and the world tilted sideways on its axis, and she was going down. She didn't fall. He caught her. They ended up on the storeroom floor. She wasn't certain of the mechanics, only that the cold stone was against her knees, and his arm was across her back, and she was inside the circle of his warmth, her cheek against the rough wool of his coat. The candle had not gone out. The dried herbs swayed slightly overhead, disturbed by the movement. He did not leave. She had expected him to leave. That was what happened in stories. The moment of consequence, and then the dignified retreat. He stayed. His hand was at the back of her head, not gripping, just present. And his breathing was uneven in a way she suspected it rarely was. "I don't know what is happening to me," he said, very quietly. Not to her, exactly. More the way a person says something aloud to test whether it is true. She felt, through the wool, the particular rhythm of his heartbeat, slower than hers, more controlled, but present. "I will not let anyone touch you," he said. The quietness of it was different from his other silences, less contained, more like something set down after being carried a long distance. She closed her eyes. The storeroom was cold and smelled of green things, and she had a wound on her neck, and something had just changed in the architecture of her life, and she had no adequate framework for any of it. Some time later, minutes, perhaps longer, he helped her to her feet. He walked her to her corridor. At the door to the servants' quarters, he stopped. He didn't look at her. "Is Mira's room nearby?" "Next door." He knocked on Mira's door. When Mira appeared, sleep-rumpled and wide-eyed, he said only, "Stay with her tonight." No explanation. He was gone before Mira could ask. The black lines began at the site of the wound and moved outward like the root system of something taking hold. Mira sat at the edge of Elara's narrow bed and held her hand and said nothing useful, which was the most useful thing she could have done. Elara was hot in a way that felt architectural. Not the surface heat of a common fever, but something deeper, structural, as if her bones were being slowly replaced with something else. She drifted in and out of sleep, and in the drifting she saw corridors that were not Ashenveil's corridors, stone that was black and volcanic, candles that burned in shades of red she had no name for, and a voice, low, accented, precise. "Lux mea, my light, I have been looking for you." She surfaced from the dream with her heart hammering and Mira's cold hand on her forehead. "Don't call anyone," Elara said. Her voice came out wrong, thicker than usual. "Elara, please." She held Mira's eyes until Mira looked away first. "He came by this morning," Mira said eventually, her voice careful. "Checked the corridor, didn't knock." Elara closed her eyes. The wound on her neck pulsed with a rhythm that was not entirely her own, like two heartbeats slightly out of time. She pressed her fingers against it and felt the lines spreading beneath her skin, faint, warm, insistent, and told herself it was healing. She was a good enough liar for most things. This she was less certain of. Seren of Veldmark had beautiful instincts. She had built her entire life on them. She had noticed the hall that morning. The way Caelum's stride had altered, just slightly, as he passed the door where Elara had been clearing broken china. Most people would not have caught it. Seren caught everything. She had spent the following 2 days having the girl watched, and what her watchers reported told her nothing specific and everything important. There was also the matter of the cup of tea she had taken with old brother Phelan, who had drunk his wine too quickly and said 2 interesting things, that Elara had an unusual instinct for herbal compounds, and that twice, when working by candlelight, Mira had noticed the girl's hands emit a faint, sourceless warmth that made the candle flame lean toward her rather than away. Like light knows its own, Mira had said, and Phelan had gone quiet. Seren did not speak of any of this. She filed it precisely in the part of her mind reserved for leverage, and she began composing a letter to an address in the south that she had been carrying in her memory for 2 careful years, waiting for the moment it might be worth the sending. That moment, she decided, had arrived. He came for Elara on the 4th night. Not through the corridor, through the servants' passage behind the east wall, a narrow tunnel that smelled of old mortar and cold air, which he apparently knew the way one knows a place visited in childhood. Mira, when Elara's absence was discovered, would find nothing missing and nothing disturbed. The abandoned room in the west wing was barely a room, a former bedchamber, stripped of furnishings, its window hung with a rotten curtain that admitted a blue shaft of moonlight onto bare stone. He had left a candle burning on the sill. She sat where he indicated, the wide stone ledge below the window, and pulled her collar aside without being asked, because she had decided somewhere in the fever that she was going to stop making herself smaller. He crouched in front of her, not kneeling for ceremony, crouching to put his eyes level with hers, and she noticed this, filed it, felt something shift in her chest at the deliberateness of it. He had cloth bandaging in his hands. He worked in silence, unwinding it carefully, beginning to clean the wound with water that smelled faintly of yarrow. His hands were large and had a quality she registered now that they were near her face. Warmth without aggression, precision without distance. He moved like someone who had been trained to do damage and had separately, privately, learned to be careful. "Does it hurt?" he asked. The honest answer was, less, in the last several minutes, than it had since the night it happened. Something in his proximity, the warmth of him, the specific gravity of his presence, pushed the ache back like a tide yielding to the moon. "Less," she said, "when you're close." She heard the words leave her mouth and could not retrieve them. He stopped working. The moonlight lay across his hands, and across the bandage, and across the space between them, blue and still. She was aware of her own breathing, of the fact that she was controlling it too deliberately. "You said that," he observed. "I know, how? I should pretend I didn't hear it." "Don't. The word came out with a steadiness that surprised her. He looked up. His eyes in the moonlight were the color of deep water at dusk, smoke and shadow, something that gray was only the surface of, something that had more underneath. She held the look without dropping it, which cost her something. He did not move forward. He did not pull back. His hands resumed, tying the last knot in the bandage, slowly, as if the motion required attention. When the final knot was done, his fingers rested on her shoulder for one moment. Not pressing, not moving, simply present, the way a flame is present in a room even before you look directly at it. Then, from somewhere below in the courtyard, the long call of a horn. An escort arriving. The sound broke the room open like a stone through ice. He withdrew his hand. He stood. He looked toward the sound, and then back at her, and his expression had the particular quality of someone returning from somewhere they had not meant to go. "I'll take you back," he said. She did not ask which arriving escort meant danger, or why the sound had brought that specific look to his face. She already knew, somewhere beneath thought, that something was about to change. She had read enough of the wrong kind of manuscripts to recognize the shape of an interruption. She followed him into the dark passage, and did not mention that she was cold until they were almost at her corridor, and the moment for mentioning it had passed. 200 years of stillness, and then a sound like the world cracking open. Draven Marcellus sat in a chamber with no windows, no fire, no light that came from anything living. The stone around him was black volcanic rock, quarried from mountains that had been cold for 1,000 years. He had not moved in 3 weeks. He had been waiting, as he had been waiting for 12 years, for a signal he was not certain would ever come. It came like a blade between the ribs. The seal broke at midnight. He felt it, the way he felt his own heartbeat, which was to say, rarely and only when something of significance was occurring. A sharp concussive wave through his chest, and then silence, and then a presence somewhere north and west that he had been carrying like a coal in his palm since the night he had placed it there. Elara. He stood. After 240 years, rising from a chair was a different experience than it had been at 30. His body remembered it, eventually. His mind was already elsewhere, moving through calculations, through the architecture of what came next. "Varek," he said. The door opened without sound. The man who entered moved like a shadow that had learned to take a human shape, precise, economical, committed to occupying as little space as possible. He had served Draven for 40 years, and had never, in that time, asked a question that was not necessary. "Prepare the escort," Draven said. "We travel under the Border Covenant, the 10-year treaty review. I want legitimate passage." Varek inclined his head. "There is one additional matter." Varek's voice was flat as winter water. We received a message 3 days ago from Veltmark.guy. Drevin turned. Lady Seren has been at Ashenveil for a week. She says she knows where the girl is. She wants a conversation about terms. Drevin was silent for a moment. In the dark, his eyes were the deep red of embers seen through black glass. Then she's been useful without knowing it. She confirms the location and gives me the timing. A pause. And the pretext. He moved to the door. Stopped. She'll want power in exchange. The Veltmark family has been looking for leverage over us since their treaty lapsed. Shall I reply? Tell her we'll discuss terms in person. He did not intend to give Seren of Veltmark anything she wanted. But there were many ways to tell someone they would receive what they were owed, and not one of them required the truth. This was what Drevin knew about the Sanguis Lux. It existed in perhaps one human per 5 generations, a mutation of blood that produced, in specific circumstances, a light-based energy capable of disrupting the oldest vampiric bindings. He had spent 2 centuries looking for it. He had found it in a Bohemian village, in a 10-year-old girl with green eyes and a quality of stillness that even then was remarkable. The blood covenant seal he had placed in her was precise. It suppressed the Sanguis Lux entirely, hiding her nature from anything supernatural that might otherwise sense her. It concealed what she was, not what she appeared to be. Her human scent, her human warmth, her human voice remained entirely legible to the world. A werewolf passing her in a corridor would smell only a young woman who worked with herbs. Nothing unusual, nothing worth noticing. Almost nothing. He had not accounted for proximity. He had not accounted for the fact that the wolf's instinct, in repeated close contact, would begin to register not the supernatural signal the seal suppressed, but the negative space around it. The particular quality of a flame seen only by the warmth it throws into a cold room. The seal hid the light. It could not hide the absence of shadow. And the bite had done what no werewolf had ever been close enough to do. The outer seal was broken. The inner covenant remained, but only barely, and the conflict between its suppression and the partially freed Sanguis Lux was burning through her like a fire contained in too small a vessel. He needed to reach her before the vessel broke. The great hall smelled of burned tallow and spiced wine, and the particular smoky sweetness of pine burning in the central hearth. Long tables had been set end to end down the center of the hall, and Caelum sat at the head of them with Lady Seren at his right hand, playing the role of an alpha, preparing his court for an alliance that everyone present understood was not yet decided. Elara worked the far end of the room. She kept her eyes on the task, refilling cups, clearing trenchers, moving with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent 12 years perfecting the art of not being noticed. She did not look at the head of the table. She looked at the head of the table. He was speaking to the Lord on his left, his hand resting on the table with the loose authority of someone in his own space, and she watched the way the firelight moved across his profile, the sharp angle of jaw, the dark eyes that from this distance appeared almost black, and then he turned his head and looked directly at her. For 1 second, neither of them moved. His hand tightened around his wine cup. She saw the tendons shift under the skin of his fingers. Then he looked away. She looked away. She went back to the cup. Her hands were entirely steady, which she thought was remarkable and unfair. The torches went strange first. Not out, they continued to burn, but their quality changed, the light pulling slightly inward, the flames less certain of themselves. And then the temperature dropping in a way that had nothing to do with drafts, a bone-deep cold moving through the hall like water rising in a flooded room, filling first the low places, then everything else. Every wolf at the tables went still. It was not a conscious choice. It was the oldest instinct, the animal recognizing, before the mind could name it, that something had entered the room that occupied a different place in the order of things. Cups were set down. Conversations died. The hounds under the tables pressed themselves flat against the stone and did not make a sound. The doors opened. Elara was at the side table, her back to the entrance. She turned. He was beautiful in the way that very dangerous things sometimes were. The beauty of ice on a cliff face. The beauty of a perfectly rendered blade. Tall, pale, dressed in black so dark it absorbed the firelight, accompanied by Varric, who moved like a shadow given instruction, and 12 guards who moved like architecture. He was scanning the room with the patience of someone who has learned that what they are looking for will always, eventually, be found. And then he found her. She watched his head turn, slowly, with the terrible precision of something tracking a signal, and his eyes settled on her across 40 feet of crowded hall. His eyes were red, not bloodshot, red in the way certain deep stones are red, ruby dark, and they held an expression she had no name for. Recognition, certainly, but beneath that something more ancient and more terrible. The expression of a man who has looked for something for a very long time and has just been told that the looking is over. She recognized him. Not from sight, from dreams, from 12 years of fever heat and half-remembered voices. Lux mea, I have been looking for you. And the recognition landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward through everything she thought she knew about herself. The serving tray tilted. She caught it. She did not drop it. From the head of the table, Lady Seren rose from her chair. Lord Morcellus. Her voice was clear and carrying, perfectly calibrated for the room. The girl you're looking for is standing there. She pointed. The hall went absolutely silent. Caelum was on his feet before Seren had finished the sentence. She had never seen him move quickly before. He was always the one who moved slowly, with intention, who let rooms rearrange themselves around his presence rather than pushing through them. Now he cleared the space between the head of the table and the side wall in 3 steps, and he was standing in front of Elara with the particular quality of a door someone had just slammed shut. Give her up, Aldrich's voice at his shoulder, barely above a whisper. We cannot fight, Dracena. Caelum turned to look at Aldrich. Something moved through his expression, not anger. Slower than anger. The specific look of a man who has just recalculated every trust he has extended over the course of years, and found the accounting wrong. The look lasted only a moment. Then it was filed away, sealed somewhere behind the storm gray of his eyes, to be examined later, in private, when there was time for the full weight of it. He turned back. She is mine, he said. To the hall. To Draven Morcellus, across the candlelit expanse of it, standing with his hands behind his back, his red eyes patient and ancient, and entirely unimpressed by the declaration. I am not here to negotiate, Draven said. His voice was pleasant. That was its most frightening quality. Its pleasantness, the voice of someone who has not needed to threaten anyone in a very long time, because the facts have always been sufficient. I am here to retrieve what belongs to me. You have until midnight. He turned and walked back through the doors, which closed behind him with the sound of winter. The tower staircase was narrow and cold, and Elara was climbing it with Caelum's hand at her elbow, not gripping, just indicating direction, when she heard Mira behind her. Wait. They stopped. Mira came up the stairs 2 at a time, her face doing something complicated that she hadn't finished deciding on yet. She stopped in front of Elara, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Mira reached into the pocket of her apron and pressed something small into Elara's hand. A piece of cloth, embroidered. A small square of linen, worked with a pattern of small blue stitches, in the shape of nothing specific and everything personal. It was my mother's pattern, Mira said. She looked at the wall behind Elara's left ear. I never finished learning it properly. Elara closed her hand around it. Mira turned and went back down the stairs before either of them could say anything else. Her footsteps were quick and precise, the sound of someone leaving before they changed their mind. Elara stood on the staircase with the scrap of embroidered linen in her fist and the whole weight of it pressing behind her eyes, and after a moment, Caelum said nothing and moved up the stairs again, and she followed him. The room at the top of the tower was small. A former watch post, its arrow slit too narrow for warmth, a single torch in the wall bracket. Caelum had sent Tavian for brother Phelan. There was nothing to do but wait. She sat on the stone bench below the slit. He stood near the door, which put maximum distance between them, in a room that was 10 feet across. If you gave me to him, she said, everyone in this castle would be alive in the morning. I know. Then why? Because I have sat in the library with you 8 times. The words came out with the particular flatness of someone reciting evidence. Because you can read Latin and Arabic, and I suspect Greek as well. Because I repaired that latch, not to keep you out, to make sure you could keep coming in. She stared at him. You knew it was me, she said. From the first night. From the first night. Something involuntary happened to her expression. She was aware of it and could not prevent it. The alpha king of one of the strongest wolf packs in Europe, she said slowly, lost sleep over a library key. He looked at her. Don't laugh. This is serious. I know. She looked back at the arrow slit, where the night was a thin black line. But also, a pause. Not entirely. He said nothing. But in the torchlight she saw, at the corner of his mouth, the very slight and quickly extinguished evidence of something that was not a smile, but was adjacent to one. The ghost of a thing kept close, allowed only the briefest air. She tucked it away carefully, that almost smile, and did not look at it too directly. Brother Phelan arrived breathless and smelling of road. He examined the wound with hands that had stopped trembling before he'd reached the top of the stairs, a professional discipline that Elara respected deeply and recognized as a form of love. The blood covenant, he said finally. He sat back on his heels. He looked at Caelum with the expression of someone delivering information they would have preferred not to possess. It was placed in her in childhood, a vampire's binding, designed to suppress what she carries in her blood and prevent detection. The Alpha's bite broke the outer seal. The inner covenant is still active. What does that mean? Caelum said. It was not quite a question. The stillness in him had a new quality, tightly managed, like a flame held steady by a hand that would not tremble. It means the energy, the sanguis lux, is now partially awake and partially bound, and the conflict between those two states is what's making her ill. Phelan looked at Elara. There are 2 ways to resolve it. The mate bond completes, the wolf bond overwrites the vampire binding entirely, or Lord Morcellus removes the covenant himself. Silence. The second option, Elara said, requires me to go with him. Yes. She looked at Caelum. He was looking at the wall. The torchlight moved across his face, and she watched him hold something very still, watched him choose, in real time, what kind of man he was going to be in this particular moment. And the watching cost her more than she had expected. They heard it before they saw it, the sound of boots on stone, too many for Tavian's count, the particular cadence of a column moving with purpose rather than patrol. Caelum moved to the door. It opened inward, which was wrong. He had bolted it. Sir Aldrich stood in the doorway with 8 of the castle guard behind him. His face had the look of a man who has made a decision and hates himself for it, and has decided that hating himself doesn't change what needs to be done. He was not proud of this moment. He was not performing the absence of pride. He simply stood in the doorway and bore the weight of it. "Caelum," he said. "Aldrich. ... One word. But Elara watched Caelum's face as he said it, watched something in it go very still, in a specific way that was different from his ordinary stillness. This was the stillness of something being filed away to be looked at later, in private, when there was time. Behind Aldrich, Lady Saren stood with her hands folded and her expression composed. She met no one's eyes. What happened in the next minutes was noise and motion and the smell of silver. Caelum fighting with a controlled ferocity that cleared the doorway twice. Elara pressing herself to the wall, and then not pressing herself to the wall, because the passage behind the east wall was 20 feet to her left, and she knew this tower, and she had, somewhere in the fever dreams of the past 4 days, seen here. She grabbed Caelum's sleeve and pulled. He looked at her. "There's a way out, this way." He followed. They made it to the passage before the silver found him, a dart from somewhere she didn't see. And then he was going down. And she was going down with him because she would not let go of his arm. And then the cold came back, all of the warmth leaching from the stone. And Draven Morcellus stepped through the doorway that Aldrich had apparently left open when he'd fled the sight of what he'd invited in. "You have played long enough, my light," Draven said. The torch went out. She woke to silk. That was the first wrong thing. The texture of it against her hands, the deep crimson of the hangings around a bed that was nothing like any bed she had ever been in. The room was large and cold, and filled with flowers that should not exist in winter. White blooms in black stone vases, their scent clean and faintly wrong, like something preserved past its season by means that had nothing to do with nature. She sat up. There were no windows. The light came from tall candles arranged along the walls, their flames entirely still, not guttering, not leaning, just burning with the perfect steadiness of something that had been told to. The door, when she moved toward it, stopped her, not with a physical barrier, but with a sensation like walking into cold, deep water, pressure rising in her chest until she stepped back. The covenant, still active, the inner seal, tethering her. She returned to the center of the room and sat on the floor, because the floor felt more honest than the furniture, and waited. She thought about Caelum. She thought about the silver dart and the way he had gone down, and she examined the inside of her own chest, the way she examined a wound, carefully looking for the extent of the damage. What she found was not despair, exactly. It was something quieter and more focused. The feeling of a person who has decided that grief is something to be held in one hand, while the other hand keeps working. She was still working. He entered without sound, and stood regarding her with the particular quality of attention that she had come to recognize, in the span of one evening, as his version of warmth. He wore black that was different from Caelum's dark wool, finer, more deliberate, the black of something that had never been anything else. He had been beautiful for 200 years. It showed, in the way that old, maintained things show their maintenance. "You're sitting on the floor," he observed. It seemed appropriate. He set a book on the small table beside the chair she had declined to use. Then, a second. She recognized the first, an Arabic astronomical treatise, the precise kind she had been reading at Ashenveil 3 weeks ago. He had done research. he had prepared for her. The gesture was not unkind. That was the most complicated thing about him. "I'm not your jailer," he said. "I'm the only person in the world who knows what you actually are." She looked at the books. She looked at him. "You know what I am because you made me this way," she said. "That isn't knowledge. That's inventory." Something moved across his face. Not pain, not quite, but the shadow of something that might have been pain if it had more room, if he had not spent 2 centuries compressing everything that was not useful into the space behind his eyes. "I created the conditions to act." "You found a child," she said, "and put a seal inside her without her consent, and then you waited 12 years for that child to become useful." She kept her voice very level. She had decided, somewhere on the floor in the center of this windowless room, that level was the only register she had left that was entirely her own. "You didn't fall in love with me. You fell in love with what I was supposed to do for you. That isn't love. That's ownership with a different name." The silence after this had texture, something uncertain underneath it, something that had perhaps not been examined in 200 years, pulled up suddenly into the cold air and found to be less solid than expected. She held the look and did not look away. Whatever was on her face, she let it be there. He did not answer. That, she thought, was its own kind of answer. She found it in the middle of the first night, a sensation thin as a wire run through the center of her sternum, running in a direction she could not see but could feel. "He's alive." She had not known she was afraid he was dead until the not knowing released. The relief was physical, a long breath let out, her body unclenching from something it had been holding without her permission. The thread was faint, barely there, vibrating at a frequency just below the audible, like a string stretched between 2 points very far apart. She lay in the dark of the windowless room and followed it with her attention, the way she had learned to read difficult texts, not forcing comprehension, just being present with it until it opened. Still alive. Somewhere. She pressed her hand against her sternum and felt it pulse, faint, irregular, but unbroken. The mate bond. Half-formed, incomplete. The wolf's claim interrupted before it could take full hold. But present. A cord with 2 ends, and she could feel both of them. In the morning, Draven came to her with a small cup and a request she recognized for what it was. "No," she said. She had barely finished the word before the door exploded inward. "He came through the ceiling." That was not precisely accurate. He came through a window on the upper level that no one had apparently considered worth sealing, which meant either that the Obsidian Spire's builders had never anticipated a 6'3" werewolf with a working knowledge of volcanic architecture and a month's cold fury to burn through, or that they had anticipated it. Given what she now knew of Draven's particular quality of confidence, she suspected the latter. Tavian came through a lower window with the efficient violence of someone who has been waiting 3 days for permission to act and has been given it at last. Brother Phelan came through the main door, which opened with fire, and a Latin invocation that sounded considerably less peaceful than anything Elara had read in his manuscript. Draven moved from the center of the room to the far wall in a gesture that barely qualified as motion, a relocation, instantaneous, his expression unchanged. 2 centuries of practice made the extraordinary look like inconvenience. "Ashvorne," he said, the way one might name a minor weather event. Moracelis. Caelum had silver worked around both forearms in long wrapped lengths, a design she had never seen before, something made for exactly this, the silver burning faint red where it contacted his skin. He was bleeding from a wound at his side that he was not acknowledging, and his eyes were changed. the dark smoke-gray edged now with a ring of amber that deepened with each breath. The wolf no longer beneath the surface, but present and visible and entirely decided. Tavian engaged Varric in the doorway with the focused attention of someone settling a debt. Brother Phelan did something with a vial that produced a sharp blue light and brought Caelum 3 steps toward the center of the room before Draven moved again. This time his hand was at Caelum's throat. Caelum's feet left the ground. Elara stood 15 feet away and watched Caelum Ashvorne refuse to put his hands up. He was hanging by his throat from Draven's grip, his face darkening, and he was looking at her, not at Draven, not at the door, not calculating an exit, looking at her with an expression she would spend a long time afterward trying to name accurately. It was not, save me. It was not even help. It was the expression of someone who has decided to trust a thing completely and has arranged their face accordingly, so that the trusted person can see the decision clearly, can carry it as the weight it is meant to be. An offering, not a demand. His eyes said, "I have put everything I have on you, and I am not afraid. I trust you." Not the words. The thing behind the words, the thing words were too small for, carried across 15 feet of cold, dark air between his eyes and hers. Something cracked open inside her ribcage. Not metaphorically, she felt it physically, like a seal giving way under sustained pressure, like the latch on the north library window finally being properly repaired from the inside. Warmth flooded outward from her sternum, moving through her chest, her shoulders, her arms, reaching her palms, and the warmth was gold. She could see it, a faint illumination emanating from her own skin, and then less faint, and then less faint, and then less faint, and then less faint still, and then something that had been sleeping inside her for 22 years opened its eyes, and Elara, Draven's voice, with something in it she had never heard before. Warning. Ramen. Jars. Something approaching alarm. The sound of a man encountering a force he had underestimated for 12 years. The light broke. The wave of energy moved outward from her like a breath, released after a very long time held. Not violent, not rageful, just inexorable. The way water released from a dam is not angry, but cannot be stopped, and it struck Draven with enough force to separate him from Caelum and carry him backward into the far wall, where he stood with the particular expression of a man encountering, for the first time in 2 centuries something, he had not. Caelum dropped. He caught himself on one knee. The light in Elara's hands dimmed slowly, like a fire settling to coals after the largest of its fuel has been consumed. She looked at her own palms for a moment, the faint gold fading to nothing, the skin beneath entirely unchanged, and then she looked at Draven. "You built me to be your key," she said. "You spent 12 years engineering what you needed, and then you waited for me to be old enough to be useful. And you call that love because you don't have a better word for it." She let the silence sit for a moment. "But I know the difference between someone who made me and someone who saw me." Draven was silent. 240 years of silence, and this particular quality of it was new. Not the silence of someone choosing not to speak, but the silence of someone who has found that the argument they prepared does not apply to the question being asked. "Go," she said. He looked at her for a long time. His red eyes moved to Caelum, who was watching from his crouch with his arms at his sides and the amber ring in his irises, now full and permanent looking. The wolf and the man in the same place at last, no longer in conflict about it. Then back to her. Whatever Draven saw in her face, he did not argue with it. He left. Not quickly. That would have been undignified. Slowly, deliberately, with the bearing of someone who has chosen to go. She understood the distinction and let him have it. It cost her nothing. She went to him. He was on one knee, not from ceremony but from the bruising around his throat and the silver that had been in contact with his skin for the past several minutes, leaching warmth the way frost leaches heat from stone. She knelt in front of him, level with him, which was the only place she had ever been comfortable, and put her hands on either side of his face. The sanguis lux moved through her palms. She could direct it now, she discovered, the way one directs water once the channel is clear, the current finding its own path toward what needed it. She let it move gently, a warmth that was not fire, seeking the damage and softening it. The bruising at his throat began to fade under her hands, pale purple to yellow to nothing. He was watching her face while she worked. She was aware of being watched. She focused on her hands. When the worst of it was healed, she sat back, and the light in her palms went to a faint glow and then to nothing. His throat showed only faint marks now. His breathing was even. The amber in his eyes had settled into something steady and permanent, warm as firelight, as afternoon through old glass. Vides me, he said. Latin, tan. Not from habit, deliberately, in the private language of an empty library at midnight, in the language that was theirs before anything else was theirs. You see me? She stopped breathing for a moment. Those were her words. What she had said to him, indirectly, in the storeroom. You are the first person who has looked at me as if I was worth the looking. He had distilled it to its simplest true form, and returned it to her across everything that had happened since. Across the length of the whole strange winter, as if he had been holding it carefully all this time, waiting for the right moment to give it back. Semper, she said. Always. His eyes, amber now, fully, the dark storm grey replaced by gold that hadn't been there before, warm and steady as a flame in still air, stayed on her face. She held the look until it became something she had no adequate word for, and then she let herself have it without needing the word. Behind them, Tavian sat against the wall with a cheerfully broken arm, and had the particular quality of someone who was looking at the ceiling with great interest, and would continue to do so indefinitely. Dawn came in grey and cold over the Carpathian foothills, and they walked through it with no particular ceremony. Caelum, Elara, Tavian with his arm splinted, and his expression suggesting he found it more inconvenient than painful, and Brother Phelan still holding the empty vial as a habit of the hands, the way men who have done something significant hold on to the evidence of it until the significance set. The horses were waiting where Phelan had left them half a mile from the spire, in a stand of black pine, their breath rising in plumes in the cold air. No one spoke much. The kind of silence that follows something enormous is its own grammar. It does not require filling. Elara kept her hand around the piece of embroidered linen in her pocket. She ran her thumb along the small blue stitches, imperfect, personal, finished by someone who had never learned the pattern properly, and thought about Mira in the warm rooms at Ashenveil, beginning a morning that would not include her. There was grief in it. She did not put it away. She held it alongside everything else, and walked. He was waiting on the road below the ridge. No horse. No escort. Standing in the grey morning with his hands at his sides, and the particular posture of a man who has rehearsed something many times and is no longer certain of the phrasing, or of whether phrasing matters, or of whether phrasing matters, or of anything except that he has to be here. Caelum stopped 20 feet from him. Aldrich went down on one knee on the frosted road without any preamble. He looked up, and what was in his expression had no performance in it. This was not a gesture designed for an audience. This was a man putting something down because he had carried it too long and could not carry it any further. Your father, he said, signed a covenant with Dracena. 14 years ago, I was his witness. The terms required. In the event that the Sanguis Lux was found and bound by Dracena, the pack would not interfere with retrieval. He stopped. He didn't know what he was signing. He didn't know about the girl. He thought it was a border agreement. The morning was very quiet. When I understood what it meant, Aldrich continued, his voice steady in the way of something that has been steadied through great effort, it was already done. He was dying. I thought, if Draven came, if there was a claim, it would be cleaner to yield than to fight a losing war over something the pack didn't yet know to protect. A breath. I was wrong. I was wrong in a way that I understand cannot be corrected. Caelum looked at him for a long time. Long enough that Aldrich had time to feel the full weight of the silence. "Stand up, Aldrich," he said finally. The older man stood. "I'm not forgiving you today," Caelum said. His voice was even, not cold, not warm. The voice of someone speaking accurately, without embellishment in either direction. "But I'm not going to kill you, because my father loved you, and that is something I cannot undo, and I've decided I'm not going to try." Aldrich said nothing. He had the expression of a man who expected a verdict and received something more complicated, and was still working out whether the complication was mercy or its own kind of sentence. Caelum walked past him. The others followed. Elara, passing Aldrich, met his eyes briefly. She did not speak. She did not need to. The letter was written that same morning, before they left the last Ironspire outpost. Caelum sealed it and left it with the garrison commander with instructions for delivery. Inside, Lady Seren of Veltmark is to leave Ashenveil freely and without harm. The marriage agreement is dissolved. Her name will not appear in the records of this house. She is to be forgotten completely, which is a sentence of its own kind. Cae. He told Elara this without emotion, standing in the pale morning with his coat thrown over one shoulder, already thinking about the road. She thought about Seren's face in the great hall, not malicious, not even cruel, just a person making a transaction they had decided was necessary, pointing at a girl whose name they had perhaps not known, settling a debt with something that did not belong to them. There was no comfort in understanding it, but there was something that was not quite sympathy and not quite contempt, and that complicated middle ground felt more honest than either. "That's enough," she said. "I thought so." They walked on. The fallow west was not picturesque. It was dense and cold, and the road deteriorated, within the first 2 days, into something that required negotiation rather than travel, fallen timber, frozen streams that had claimed the path entirely, a bridge that was more philosophical than structural. The first settlement they established was technically a collection of repurposed storage buildings on the eastern edge of a frozen lake, their roofs intact by virtue of stubbornness rather than engineering. Caelum turned out to have opinions about structural reinforcement that no one had anticipated, and which were, on examination, entirely correct. Tavian, one-handed, turned out to be more useful than most people were, with two. There was an efficiency to working with a limitation, a directness that suited the work and suited him. Elara spent the first week cataloguing what grew beneath the snow, more than she'd expected. Enough. It was not an elegant beginning. There was no ceremony for it, no moment that felt like a threshold crossed. They simply stopped moving one morning and looked around and started building, and the building became the settlement, and the settlement became, gradually and unglamorously, something that might one day become a place. She thought it was perhaps, of all the beginnings available to her, the most honest one. 3 months later, the main building had a room with 4 walls, a window that actually closed, 2 bookshelves. Phelan had argued for the second, and been correct about it, and a table placed below the window where the light fell correctly in the afternoon. It was nothing like the library at Ashenveil. The shelves were raw pine, the table uneven at one leg, the floor plain stone with no rugs to soften it. There was a candle on the table and a crack in the corner plaster that she had been meaning to fill for 2 weeks. She was at the table when she heard his footsteps on the stair. She recognized them now, the particular rhythm, unhurried but present, the weight of them even on new wood. She did not look up. She had learned that looking up immediately gave information she preferred to withhold for one more breath. He came in. She heard him stop. She looked up. He was holding a book. Not the leather-bound Latin compendium she recognized, worn soft at the spine from years of handling. Something new, smaller, older, bound in cloth of faded brown that had once been blue. He set it on the table beside her current page, with the same economy of motion he had used the first time, in the large library at Ashenveil, setting a book spine up at the end of the reading table as if he put it down mid-thought. As if it had always been the plan, as if the question of whether it would be received had never really been in doubt. She looked at it. Arabic script on the cover, astronomical, the constellations of the southern hemisphere, latitudes she had never visited, star patterns she had only read about from accounts of travelers who had gone where she had not yet gone. She looked at him. "You're still doing this," she said. "I'll keep doing this." He sat down in the chair across the table and took out the volume he had apparently been reading in his own time. She could tell from the position of the bookmark that he was 2/3 through it, had been working on it for days. He opened it without further ceremony. She looked at the Arabic book for a moment. Then she opened it. The candle on her side of the table, and the moonlight coming through the new window. The window that actually closed, the window they had built correctly the 3rd time, threw 2 different kinds of light across the space between them. Not the same light. Compatible. Outside, the fallow west was dark and cold and fully theirs. She turned a page. He turned a page. The room was quiet, in the way that rooms are quiet when the people in them are not performing silence, but simply living inside it. The specific peace of 2 people who have found, after a great deal of difficulty, the exact right place to be. Not the silence of restraint, not the silence of things unsaid, the silence of things so thoroughly understood that saying them aloud would only be repetition. She did not look up. She was smiling,